Nobody recorded the last day. There was no final letter, no desperate signal fire, no mass grave to explain what happened. One morning in the mid-1400s, an entire civilization of Norse settlers, thousands of people who had carved their lives into the frozen edge of the known world for nearly 5 centuries, simply ceased to exist in the historical record. Gone. Silently. Completely. And for 600 years, the world accepted that answer. They vanished. Case closed. But what modern DNA science has just revealed isn't a story of disappearance at all. It's something far more unsettling. It's a story of transformation. There is a church ruin sitting at the edge of a fjord in southern Greenland that most people on Earth have never heard of. It is crumbling slowly into the permafrost, its stone walls collapsing under the weight of centuries, surrounded by a cemetery where the bones of people have waited for over 600 years to be understood. Archaeologists who have walked those grounds describe a strange, hollow feeling, the sense that something happened here that the historical record simply refused to explain. The graves are real. The ruins are real. The evidence of a civilization is overwhelmingly, undeniably real. And yet the people who built all of it vanished without a single word of explanation left behind. This is where the story begins. Not with a battle, not with a plague, not with a dramatic climactic disaster captured in some medieval chronicle. The story begins with silence. And silence, as any intelligence analyst will tell you, is never actually empty. Silence is a message. You just have to know how to read it. Sometime in the mid-1400s, the Norse colonies in Greenland went dark and their citizens disappeared. Records from the Middle Ages, filled with details on the beginnings of the colonies and stories from their middle years, were silent on the ending. If the Greenlanders all died in some apocalypse, plague, say, or warfare, their cousins in Europe apparently failed to notice. And if they all fled the enormous island, there's no mention of why or where they went. Thomas McGovern, a professor of archaeology at Hunter College, who has spent over 4 decades studying what researchers call the Norse problem, put it plainly, well-informed people in Europe had absolutely no idea what happened to the Greenlanders. Think about what that means. You have thousands of people. You have trade routes. You have church records. You have a civilization that had been operating for nearly 5 centuries. And then, nothing. No one in Europe noticed them disappear. That is not how civilizations die. That is how civilizations transform. But before we get to what actually happened, and what DNA has now confirmed, we need to understand exactly who these people were. Because even that much is not what most of us were taught. And this is where the first layer of the story starts to unravel. Contrary to the violent pop culture Vikings of our time, the Norse who settled Greenland were the last in a great wave of westbound European settlers who had carried their culture from the fjords and heathlands of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden to a series of cold and remote outposts, the Orkney Islands, the Faroes, Iceland. These were not raiders. These were not berserkers with painted faces and bloodlust in their eyes. These were farmers, pastors, craftsmen, mothers, children, people who loaded open wooden ships with livestock and lumber, with wool and children and hope, and sailed into waters that no European civilization had dared to cross. They didn't do it for conquest. They did it because they were looking for land. And Greenland, in the late 900s AD, offered them something extraordinary. During a period of relative warmth known as the medieval climate anomaly, its southern coasts were actually hospitable enough to graze cattle and grow limited crops. During the medieval climate anomaly, which began about AD 900, temperatures in the North Atlantic region rose higher than they had been in previous decades. While it wasn't as warm as the world we know today, it probably decreased sea ice cover and mitigated the violence and frequency of ocean storms. The timing was almost miraculous. A window had opened in the Arctic, and the Norse walked through it. Here's where it gets more complicated than any textbook ever told you. Those buried in the 1,000-year-old graveyard in southern Greenland are among the first settlers to have arrived on the island after it was colonized in AD 985 by Icelanders and Norwegians, except that the genetic data from the remains show that these Nordic pioneers also had Celtic blood in their veins, probably originating from the British Isles. Curator Jette Arneborg from the National Museum in Copenhagen, one of the Danish archaeologists who studied these early southern Greenland settlers, stated that initial results surprisingly suggested that the people in the graves were more Celtic than Nordic. Read that again carefully. The people we have been calling Vikings, the Norse settlers of Greenland, the founders of what we considered to be a pure Scandinavian outpost at the edge of the medieval world, were, genetically speaking, not purely Scandinavian at all. And this was just the beginning of what the bones were hiding. An international team of researchers drew on remains unearthed at more than 80 sites across northern Europe, Italy, and Greenland to map the genomes of 442 humans buried between roughly 2400 BC and 1600 AD. The results showed that Viking identity didn't always equate to Scandinavian ancestry. Just before the Viking Age, around 750 to 1050 AD, people from southern and eastern Europe migrated to what is now Denmark, introducing DNA more commonly associated with the Anatolia region. In other words, the people raiding the coastlines of England and settling the Arctic fringe of Greenland were themselves the product of multiple migrations, multiple genetic bloodlines, multiple cultural fusions that had been blending together for centuries before the first longship ever left a Norwegian fjord. The study shows that Viking identity was not limited to people with Scandinavian genetic ancestry. The genetic history of Scandinavia was influenced by foreign genes from Asia and southern Europe before the Viking Age. Early Viking Age raiding parties were an activity for locals and included close family members. What most historians never told you is that the concept of Viking was never really an ethnic label. It was a cultural identity, a way of life, a system of values, trade practices, and social organization that absorbed outsiders and reshaped them rather than excluding them. The people who built those stone churches in the Greenlandic fjords were not a monolithic Nordic race. They were a living, evolving, genetically diverse civilization, which makes what happened to them later all the more extraordinary. Because when you understand that these people were already masters of cultural adaptation, the question of their disappearance changes completely. You stop asking what destroyed them, and you start asking something far more dangerous. What did they become? The standard narrative, the one taught in schools, repeated in documentaries, recycled in popular history, goes something like this. The Norse settlers of Greenland were stubborn, inflexible. They clung to their European farming traditions in a landscape that could not sustain European farming. They refused to learn from the Inuit. They kept their livestock, and when their animals starved, so did they. The more flexible Inuit, with a culture focused on hunting marine mammals, thrived. This was the tidy story. This was the explanation that Jared Diamond popularized in his 2005 bestseller, Collapse, that the Norse were undone by the same stubbornness that had made them great. They could not adapt, and so they perished. It is a satisfying story. It is logical. It is morally instructive. And according to the most current research, it is almost certainly wrong. That is what archaeologists believed until a few years ago. McGovern's own PhD dissertation made the same arguments, but then the evidence started pushing back. Excavations of Norse sites revealed something that the old narrative could not explain. Seal bones, enormous quantities of seal bones. A Danish-Canadian research team demonstrated that the Norse society did not die out due to an inability to adapt to the Greenlandic diet. An isotopic analysis of their bones shows they ate plenty of seals. If the Norse were stubbornly clinging to their cattle and sheep, refusing to adapt to Arctic survival strategies, then why does the bone chemistry of their own skeletons show that by the end, they were eating marine mammals in quantities that rival the Inuit themselves? This is not the behavior of people who refuse to adapt. This is the behavior of people who are adapting, and adapting fast. But here's where it gets worse, because adaptation was not just happening in what the Norse ate. It was happening in how far they were willing to go, literally. A study published in 2024 used DNA to trace walrus tusk artifacts back to the areas where the animals had originally lived. It showed that the Norse probably traveled deeper into the north than previously thought, perhaps all the way into the high Arctic and even into parts of Arctic Canada, journeys of hundreds or even thousands of miles. Such trips, the paper noted, would have put many lives at stake. They also would have consumed precious resources and possibly threatened the stability of the entire society. Stop and let that land. Norse settlers in the 1300s and 1400s, at the same time, we are told, they were collapsing under the weight of climate change and cultural rigidity, were mounting expeditions into the high Arctic that covered thousands of miles, in open boats, into waters clogged with pack ice, hunting walruses that weighed 3,000 pounds and could crush a boat with a single movement. These people were not failing. They were operating at an extraordinary level of courage and strategic capability, and they were doing it for one reason, the walrus ivory trade. New research shows that the Vikings traveled more than 6,000 kilometers to the Arctic to hunt for walrus. DNA analyses reveal that walrus ivory from Greenland was brought to Europe and probably as far as the Middle East via extensive trade networks. The Norse settlements in Greenland were not some isolated, struggling outpost clinging to existence at the edge of the world. They were the upstream node of a global supply chain. When the Crusades temporarily disrupted elephant ivory trade routes from Africa, European and Middle Eastern merchants turned to walrus ivory. And the only people in the world who could supply it at scale were the Norse of Greenland. According to James Barrett, an archaeologist at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Greenlanders were even able to use tusks to pay tithes that would eventually reach the church in Rome. Think about what that means. The church in Rome was receiving walrus tusk payments from people living on the far edge of the Arctic. The Norse of Greenland were not peripheral to medieval civilization. They were financially integrated into its highest power structures. So why did they disappear? The honest answer, which very few mainstream sources have been willing to say out loud, is this: we do not actually know that they disappeared. We know that they stopped being recorded. Those are two profoundly different things, and the distinction between them is where the real story lives. What the most recent DNA and archaeological research is quietly confirming is something that shatters the entire framework of the standard narrative. The Norse of Greenland were not a sealed, static population waiting to die. They were a genetically diverse, culturally adaptable, logistically sophisticated civilization that had been changing and evolving for 5 centuries. The combined archaeological and genetic record underscores a story of transient settlement, long-distance connections, and eventual decline, a legacy that shapes regional identity and continues to prompt research into resilience and cultural exchange in extreme environments. But decline is a word chosen carefully by cautious academics. What informed observers who have examined the totality of the evidence are beginning to suggest is something far more interesting than decline. The question being asked in the most serious research circles right now is whether the Norse of Greenland didn't disappear at all, but instead merged, transformed, became something new. One theory is that at least some of them joined the folk of America, probably the Inuit, and here is where the evidence gets genuinely strange. Greenland was uninhabited when the Norse first arrived there in the 900s. The Inuit currently living in Greenland arrived in the 1300s. So for the first 300 years of Norse settlement in Greenland, they were the only people on the island, entirely alone at the edge of the world. When the Inuit finally did arrive, migrating south from the high Arctic, both populations occupied the same island simultaneously for roughly a century. The Norse were in the southwest. The Inuit were expanding from the north. Contact was inevitable. Trade almost certainly happened. And the critical question, the one that DNA science is only now beginning to have the tools to answer, is whether that contact went deeper than trade. We do have evidence that the indigenous peoples of Newfoundland, the Beothuk, are in fact related to a surviving group of Icelandic families. So the Norse did intermarry wherever a population of indigenous people did exist, even if they were there for a relatively short time. If this happened in Newfoundland, where Norse contact was brief, episodic, and limited, what might have happened in Greenland, where 2 populations shared an island for over a century? Limited evidence indicates that Norse genetic signatures did not become pervasive in the island's later population, but this conclusion remains provisional given sampling limitations. A small number of Y lineages can exaggerate apparent patterns. Dating uncertainty for some early samples further complicates chronological assignment. Notably, the dataset shows no clear signal of Arctic-specific maternal haplogroups commonly found in contemporary Inuit populations, a point that may reflect limited admixture or sampling bias. Here is what that cautious scientific language is actually saying when you translate it out of academic restraint. We don't have enough data yet to prove what happened. The sample sizes are too small. The dating is uncertain, and the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In other words, the question of whether Norse genes were absorbed into Inuit populations, or whether Norse individuals physically joined Inuit communities, is not settled. It is open. It is alive. And every new excavation, every new ancient DNA sample pulled from the Greenlandic permafrost has the potential to rewrite everything. And this is where everything changes, because the permafrost itself is now speaking. Climate change, which ironically may have contributed to the end of the Norse settlements, is now also destroying the very archaeological evidence that could explain what happened. Most sites on the island seem to be swiftly disintegrating, their buried artifacts melting into a kind of brown sludge. The frozen soil that preserved Norse bones, Norse wood, Norse cloth, and Norse genetic material for 6 centuries is now thawing. Every year that passes without intensive excavation is a year in which irreplaceable biological evidence dissolves permanently. The race to understand what happened to the Greenland Norse is not just an academic exercise. It is a literal race against time, against warming temperatures, against the slow erasure of the only witnesses who ever existed, the bones of the dead. And yet the bones that have already been recovered are telling us things that should make us deeply uncomfortable with the story we thought we knew. The Norse who settled Greenland were not who we thought they were. The lead scientist of the major DNA study stated, "This study changes the perception of who a Viking actually was. No one could have predicted these significant gene flows into Scandinavia from southern Europe and Asia happened before and during the Viking Age." The genetic history of the Norse people is not a story of ethnic purity radiating outward from a Scandinavian heartland. It is a story of constant absorption, constant mixing, constant reinvention. The Vikings who raided the coasts of England carried the genes of people from Anatolia, from the Celtic fringe of Britain, from the steppes of Central Asia. The settlers who built stone churches in Greenlandic fjords were the biological descendants of a dozen different population waves. carrying within their DNA a history of migration and fusion that stretched back thousands of years before the first longship was ever built. Skeletons from famous Viking burial sites in Scotland were actually local people who could have taken on Viking identities and were buried as Vikings. Many Vikings actually had brown hair, not blonde hair. The blonde, blue-eyed Norseman of popular imagination was always a myth. What DNA confirms is that Viking was never a race. It was a role. It was a cultural identity so powerful, so magnetic, so adaptable, that it absorbed outsiders and made them its own, repeatedly across centuries, across continents. Which brings us back to Greenland, and to the single most haunting question that modern science has forced us to confront. If the Norse were culturally adaptable, demonstrated. If they were eating seals and adapting their diet, demonstrated. If they were making high Arctic expeditions and integrating into global trade networks, demonstrated. If their identity was never ethnically exclusive but always culturally permeable, demonstrated. Then what, precisely, is the mechanism by which 5,000 people simply cease to exist without leaving a trace in the historical record of Europe? The answer that is emerging from the most serious current research is both simpler and more profound than any of the dramatic collapse narratives that have dominated this field for decades. Scientists are pretty sure they have at least part of the answer. They simply up and left. When the climate deteriorated and their way of life became more difficult, they did what people have done throughout the ages. They looked for a more opportune place to live, says Niels Linnerup, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Copenhagen. But left is doing enormous work in that sentence. Left to go where? Left to become what? Left as Norse settlers sailing back to Europe? Or left in a more fundamental sense, left their identity, their cultural markers, their distinctly Norse way of organizing the world, and became something that European record keepers could no longer recognize or track? The skeletal evidence shows signs that they slowly left Greenland. For example, young women are underrepresented in the graves in the period toward the end of the Norse settlement. This is the kind of evidence that keeps archaeologists awake at night. In a dying civilization, and one being wiped out by plague or starvation or climate catastrophe, you would expect to find roughly equal numbers of all demographics in the grave record. You would find the very young and the very old. You would find men and women. But what the graves in late-period Norse Greenland show is a population that was demographically incomplete. The young women were gone. Not dead, gone. They had left the island. And when young women leave a population, they take with them the future of that population. They take with them the possibility of future births. What remains is a community aging toward its own end, not through catastrophe, but through emigration. Some of them went back to Iceland or to Norway, or perhaps to the new Norse communities that were forming along the North American coast. Some of them, and here is the possibility that no one in the mainstream narrative has been willing to sit with, may have gone north, into the territory of the Inuit, into the very communities that were simultaneously expanding south through Greenland during this same period. The Inuit, after all, were not static either. They were a mobile, adaptable, extraordinarily sophisticated Arctic people with rich trade networks of their own. The idea that Norse individuals, especially younger women, especially those who had grown up eating seal and learning Arctic survival, might have integrated into Inuit communities is not romantic speculation. It is a logical extension of everything we know about how human populations actually behave when civilization's under stress. And what modern DNA research is finding, slowly, provisionally, with appropriate scientific caution, is that the boundary between Norse and Inuit in late medieval Greenland may have been far more porous than anyone previously imagined. In Greenland, Viking DNA is found only in old bones. The modern Greenlandic population, descended primarily from Inuit lineages, shows no clear Norse genetic signature in the studies conducted so far. But the studies conducted so far have been limited by small sample sizes, incomplete geographic coverage, and the rapidly deteriorating condition of archaeological sites. The absence of Norse DNA in modern Greenlandic populations proves nothing about what happened in the 1400s. It only proves that if Norse genes were absorbed, they were absorbed at low enough frequencies that current detection methods, working from current sample sizes, cannot reliably find them. This is not chaos. This is a detection problem, and detection problems get solved. What is already beyond any reasonable doubt is this. The Norse of Greenland were never the simple, mono-ethnic, culturally rigid people that 6 centuries of historical narrative described. They were diverse in their origins. They were adaptive in their behavior. They were globally integrated in their economics. They were militantly exploratory in their geography. And they existed at the intersection of 2 of the most consequential demographic processes of the medieval world, the expansion of Norse Atlantic civilization westward, and the expansion of Thule Inuit culture southward, in a place where those 2 processes could not help but collide. The real story of the Greenland Norse is not a story of failure. Failure is easy to document. People who fail leave abundant evidence. Bodies, burned buildings, desperate final records. What the Norse left behind is something far more ambiguous. Stone churches slowly being consumed by permafrost. A handful of ancient bones carrying genetic secrets we are only now beginning to decode. And a silence in the historical record so complete that for 600 years, everyone assumed it meant death. But silence can mean something else entirely. Silence can mean transformation. Silence can mean that the people who were being tracked by European record keepers stopped being the kind of people that European record keepers knew how to track. Silence can mean that a civilization reached a threshold of climate stress, of economic pressure, of demographic strain, and instead of collapsing, dissolved, spread itself into other communities, became invisible to the historical gaze, not because it ceased to exist, but because it ceased to look like itself. DNA analyses reveal that walrus ivory from Greenland was brought to Europe and probably as far as the Middle East via extensive trade networks. These were people who were connected to the world. These were people who understood how to move goods across 6,000 kilometers of ocean and ice. The same logistical intelligence, the same adaptive capability, the same willingness to travel into unknown and dangerous territory that made the Norse of Greenland successful traders and hunters would also have made them perfectly capable of executing a quiet, organized, multi-generational emigration back to Iceland, forward to North America, or north into the expanding world of the Inuit, without leaving the kind of dramatic, catastrophic record that European chroniclers would have found interesting enough to document. Nobody writes about things going quietly. History records battles, not evacuations, catastrophes, not slow transitions. The disappearance of the Greenland Norse from the historical record may be exactly what a successful, intelligent, adaptive immigration looks like from the outside. And now, in the year 2025, we stand at an extraordinary moment. The tools of ancient DNA analysis have become precise enough to pull genetic information from bones that spent 6 centuries in melting permafrost. The archaeological excavations being conducted at Norse sites in southern Greenland are finding objects, a child's wooden toy horse, dark and gleaming after 500 years in the wet earth, that tell us these were fully realized human lives, not statistical data points in a historical mystery. And the questions being asked by the most rigorous researchers in this field are becoming more sophisticated, more daring, and more uncomfortable with the simplicity of the old answers. Were the Greenland Norse who we thought they were? No. The DNA proves it. They were a multi-ethnic, genetically diverse civilization built on Celtic foundations as much as Scandinavian ones, carrying in their bones the genetic legacy of migrations from Anatolia and the steppes of Asia and the islands of the North Atlantic. Did they disappear? That depends entirely on what you mean by disappear. Their churches are ruins. Their farms are sludge. Their language is gone. Their distinctly Norse cultural identity vanished from Greenland sometime around 1450. But their genes, and possibly their descendants, may be far closer and far more present than any of us have been taught to look for. The last documented date of Norse presence in Greenland comes from a 1408 wedding record, a young woman named Sigrid Bjornsdottir marrying in a church that still partially stood. After that date, there is nothing. Not a death record, not a distress signal, not a single document from Europe asking what happened to the thousands of people who had been sending walrus ivory to Rome just decades before. The silence is total. And the silence, when you understand everything that the DNA is now revealing, feels less like an ending and more like a doorway. Something walked through that doorway. The question that will define the next decade of Arctic archaeology and ancient genomics research is simply this. What did it become on the other side? The bones are still in the ground. The permafrost is still thawing. And somewhere in the genetic material of populations that stretch from Greenland to Iceland to the eastern coast of North America, the answer may already exist, waiting not for someone to invent it, but for someone with precise enough tools and brave enough questions to finally read it. This is not a closed case. This was never a closed case. It was always a question disguised as an answer. And the further science looks, the more certain it becomes that the real story of the Greenland Norse has not yet been told. Not even close.